here in the UK, continuing to provide the sort of comic relief of how to handle COVID-19. But we are at least now jabbing people at a remarkable rate. My wife was jabbed herself only a few days ago, so there is light at the end of this seemingly never-ending tunnel. To build on David's kind introduction, for those who have had the displeasure of meeting me, nice to see you again. For those that haven't, lovely to see you. My name is Miles. I'm based here in the UK, and I have been running an organisation called Afixious Films for about 1,000 years now. I started the business when I was at school. Actually, I was at an independent school in Leicestershire, fiercely and angrily Catholic organisation, which I think piqued my interest in theology, which is actually what I went on to study with an academic hat on, but actually started the business first. So from the age of 16, I've been producing videos all across the world, actually. And since 2007-ish, have been applying my fascination with the education sector to my love of telling stories with films. And you add those two together and you get a very interesting job. I've never had a proper one, so I might as well have this interesting one to do instead. My sort of fundamental starting point with education and how we talk about it and how we promote it, particularly with film, but I think this applies generally as well, is that I have never met two schools the same. Despite having worked with about 630-ish across the world now, I've never met two the same. And yet the thing I find remarkable is that I find so many films, particularly, which are straight copies of each other. And that I've never been able to properly reconcile. That you can have such wonderfully diverse organizations, and yet so often there are sort of tropes and predictable mechanisms that are used, particularly within film, to talk about an organization. And I find that a little bit sad more than anything else. One of the main reasons we've stayed working so sort of vehemently and passionately within our sector is that we think schools, particularly international schools actually, are such hotbeds of storytelling. They're like little gold mines for telling stories. Whether or not one is allowed to, I think, is another question. And we're perhaps all sat either on or slightly beneath SLTs or SMTs or whatever our language is. And that is sometimes the limiting factor of to what extent are we allowed to tell stories that are distinctive. And that's where we get to that word. Now, obviously, this has been enormously heightened in recent times, and this idea of what it means to be distinctive and how we execute distinctive are actually two slightly different questions, and they're ones that we're increasingly wrestling with our work, with our film work as much as any other work that we do. But me, it's important when we take this idea of distinctiveness that we approach it actually quite scientifically as well as quite intuitively at the same time. If people don't have a problem, if this is breaking group rules, David, please say so. But if I can share a couple of little prompts, that would be very useful for myself as much as for anything else, because I'll simply forget what I needed to say. So if people don't have a problem with that, I will very quickly just share a screen that I have here, which is just a little bit of a rundown of some ideas around what we mean by being distinctive, and the sort of thought process that we go through when we're building film campaigns or other campaigns to make sure that ideas that we are generating are truly distinctive rather than just seem good at any one particular point. And we break this idea of distinctiveness down essentially into three main areas, and I'll talk about each one for about 2 minutes each. The first is this idea of context. This is a word that I beat schools over the head with incessantly, because I think on the one hand, it is extremely endearing that schools, particularly independent schools, fee-paying private schools, whatever you want to call them, are their own little microcosmic universes. I think that's one of the things that attracts us as parents. I'm speaking as one at the same time, is that they are self-subsisting little universes that are sort of pleasantly inward-looking, in that they exist within themselves. Whereas the reality is, for anybody on the outside, they only exist in context. They only exist compared to school X or school Y or school Z or any other thing. And so distinctiveness is only distinctive within its own context. And that is a sort of an interesting starting point. We need to be more distinctive than anybody else that is within our context if we want to be truly interesting and truly stick out on that front. And the fact that an awful lot of the time, depending on your national context, and I appreciate that international contexts differ enormously, the fact that people are buying from shortlists of organizations where at least one of their options costs nothing is a very interesting sort of back foot starting position when it comes to this idea of distinctiveness. But very, very closely followed behind that is this idea that people have opinions of your organization or are happy to form one completely regardless of anything as trivial as truth or fact, and that again is a very, very interesting starting point that we have to take into account when we're evaluating context, in that people are positioning schools so often alongside other schools, either on completely false grounds, once, twice, several times, or with little grains of truth that may be partially true or whatever it may be. And then there is this really, really key one, and I've developed a sort of healthily cynical, thick skin about this sector in the years that I've worked in it. And one of them is the fact that the appreciation of what may be distinctive to a particular organization can become quite blinkered. And that organizations, particularly leadership in with organizations, can sort of artificially promote the distinctiveness of a particular feature or factor of a school when it isn't. And quite often it falls on us as marketeers or admissions professionals or whatever that may be, to actually have to be the bad guy and have to be the one that stands there and goes, yes, that feature of our organization is fantastic, but is it distinctive? And that's a difficult thing to answer sometimes. This is a particularly UK and particularly UK prep school sort of thing, but the amount of times that I've been led round, leafy prep schools in the United Kingdom, being told with great earnesty and honesty that isn't it wonderful that we have this forest school at this particular organisation, and I can never bring myself to talk about the 15 that I walked around last week, and that may not necessarily be as completely mind blowing to a buyer as any others. So context is this massive starting point for us. If we're going to play with the idea of how are we going to be distinctive in how we talk about ourselves, that's where for us we have to start. The second place that we tend to take people beyond this is what we call somewhat arbitrarily, I suppose, the rule of stuff. And again, this is something that I cling to as a feature of the way that we think in this sector, and it's this idea of, for want of a better phrase, commanding the generic. Okay, I'm of the belief that good independent schools are 80 to 85% identical to each other, okay, in what they offer, and that's actually good. That is a very good feature of our world that we are in, because it shows a consistency of quality across the board, and that's fantastic. That's reassuring for a buyer, but again, very difficult for the marketeer. So we tend to place ourselves when we're embracing a new organization and what it is we want to say about this particular organization is there genuinely different stuff to talk about? Back to that concept of context, bringing that back again, or is it our job to say the stuff differently? Now, I don't want to get over semantic and sort of bogged down in how the English language works, but that is an interesting sort of definition between the two. Because if we don't, we very quickly find ourselves on the school promotional video bingo card, which I have long enjoyed using here on the right. Or on the left, depending on how you're looking at it. But so many of these features so often crop up and are the opposite of distinctive in that regard. My personal favorite being the sort of the head of school walking along a pathway with a suspiciously diverse group of children, often with their arms slightly outstretched in a come unto me type pose. But we see these things all the time. And so the idea of if we've only got the same stuff as everyone else, our job is to say it differently, rather than necessarily try and overprove that ours is more distinctive than anyone else's. And this brings us to the final point, and beyond this I will be quiet. this is the sort of the science bit of what we talk about. Having spent a very, very long time now producing video work, both in the UK and across the world, in Europe, in America, in the Middle East, all over the place, we've started to identify some of the traits of really great and distinctive work, particularly within video. That happens to be my main area, but I think this applies in lots of different, in print, in digital, in photography, etc., etc., etc. And invariably, what we have found is if one, two, or three of this holy trinity of sort of psychological footholds are present, it makes it good. Now, it's an interesting activity to think about the last piece of advertising or brand film or whatever it may be that you saw, and go back and compare it against these three ideas, because it does have a remarkable consistency, actually, in how these things in how these things are gested by the human mind. The first is the idea of spectacle. Just simple wow. There is a reason that theatre and Hollywood and all of those things exist, okay? And it's because we as humans like to be wowed. We like to be given a spectacle, particularly right now, you know, when we're all sick of the same four walls. I am in our back bedroom right now. I bet some of you are as well. And that sense of spectacle is something that we miss. And that is something that can be generated in the right context. The second one is very culturally sensitive and differs enormously depending on where you are in any particular part of the world. But this idea of irreverence, okay? There are an awful lot of mediums where we can and should be serious in what we say. If we're writing formal letters or writing formal website copy or whatever it may be, we sometimes have to be serious. It's what the medium dictates. But video has that extra bit of emotional power that allows us to be irreverent. I also do think that an awful lot of independent school marketing is dreadfully serious. Given how fun the schools are, I do think, again, there's a disconnect there. And digging into that sense of irreverence, that's not necessarily belly laughing. That's just a sense that we are willing to be slightly left or right of the conservative norm. And then at the other end of that, and the final point that I'll throw into the mix here before I stand back, is this idea of vulnerability. Okay, I think this has been aggressively heightened in the last 12 months, but the willingness to accept that we are human beings talking to human beings is something that I don't think is picked up on often enough by particularly the world of independent school marketing and private school, whatever you want to call it, marketing. I think often we are obliged or forced into having a single tone, which is that everything is great all the time, nothing goes wrong ever in our marketing. And that is about as far from the reality as you're ever going to get. And what stories that land with us are stories that have narrative arcs. They have ups and they have downs. Disney used the same one in every film they make. You know, isn't everything wonderful? Oh my God, horrendous tragedy. Simba's dad's died. This is awful. Turn it off, turn it off, turn it off. Okay. And then things gradually get better and better and better and better and better. And we think they're going to be great. We take a hit and then bang, we end on a high. It's the same story every time, but it works. And this is the point. How can we inject narrative arc? How can we inject rise and fall in how people feel without any vulnerability? Now, that is an incredibly difficult thing for a school to embrace. And it's incredibly difficult for heads of schools and people like that to really get their head around this idea of being properly vulnerable in front of your audience, because people are paying a lot of money, etc., 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 etc. But the reality of this is that we are engaging with other humans. And if the last 12 months isn't going to hammer that home, I don't know what is. So it's there are lots of ways you can look at distinctive. For me, they are three decent starting points. I'm sure there's an awful lot more expertise in this room than I can bring, but it's very, very useful, I think, to just maybe take a step back about what that word, which is a sort of holy grail for us, actually means. And there are some thoughts, I suppose, just to get us started.
In our group, we were just having that we reached that point where we had a minute to go, and the question was, who would like to be the spokesperson for the group? At which point, Claudine immediately disappeared. I have never seen anyone leave a breakout group as quickly as Claudine did.
I know.
It was frightening speed. So with that,
I felt myself alone. I was like, what happened?
you would think after 1 year we'd be used to Zoom, wouldn't we? But I still think that there's something in our DNA that means that we regularly forget the mute button and things like that. But there we go.
Maybe it's the old. Where did I park?
Exactly. I can never remember whether I turn left or right.
What did I do in my car? It's the same thing.
Yeah. So well, on that note, I mean, I hope that that your groups were as stimulating as ours in conversation. So, who would like to give some feedback, some of the themes that maybe you were discussing, some of the questions that you were wrestling with?
I can go for room number 1. I feel like we probably had the same conversation as mostly everyone else. We were talking about how we know the value and the importance of, being authentic and giving an authentic message, but how do you find the balance of authenticity versus making sure everything is nice and tight and glossy in your messaging and your videos and your website? We also talked about USPs and how it's important to get away from the language that we all use as international schools, like global change maker. We nurture our students, and I mean, you all know the buzzwords. But where and how do you find that balance? Like, we all know it's very important, but how do you do it, and how do you do it successfully? So we had a lot of conversation around that and how each of our schools are dealing with it. Did I get that right, ladies?
Thumbs up from group 1. Okay, so let's go. Well, you were group 1, so let's go to group 2 then to see who knows that they were in group 2. That's the first question.
I believe that was us, wasn't it?
Okay, so I think Raluca nominated herself by process of she was the last person to exit the room.
I told you, you have to read things differently. We'll have a talk. So what I came out of this talk with was the fact that, but we had the chance of having Miles with us, so we picked his brain further. So he left me with something of this conversation, that people remember very little of what you want to say. And I can see myself in this, and I can see most of communications in school wanting to say everything and say it again, and it's so important, so I have to now show it somehow. So I will keep this in mind next time I'll work on something, because they remember only 15%, as Miles says, of what your message is actually. So we'll maybe try to focus on what's that 15%. And I think we are all biased in what our messages are. And I really think showing our communication to other people in our team helps us to see these flaws in our communication. This is what I took out of the conversation. Maybe Claudine or Mary want to fill in the blanks, but
well, maybe if I just expand on that point very slightly, it's a relatively well accepted thing in our world. When you delve into the psychological studies about how people receive and consume video material, particularly video material, is that people remember far less than you think they're going to. It is around 15% on average that people will remember of any particular piece of rich media that they will watch. When they are asked a significant list of questions, they will only actually be able to accurately identify around about 15%. But also that 15% tends to drop into two very distinctive categories. One, and the primary and the majority, is that people will remember the broad emotional resonance of a piece. They will remember if it was happy, if it was sad, if it was exciting, if it was melancholic, whatever it may be. They will remember what it felt like, and people's ability to respond to a questionnaire after watching something with a series of emotions and identify the correct one is extremely high. People will often be able to remember that. Also, people then tend to remember incredibly precise details. which is annoying for marketeers. But people will remember, the color tie that somebody had on, or what number was on the back of a shirt. But they won't see, as we all know from that famous study, the gorilla that ran through the back of the frame at one point. So another one of the things that our conversation drifted onto was how do we get management teams particularly to take this kind of thing seriously? Well, the reality of the actual psychology behind what we're doing is that we are far better focused making our 15% brilliant than worrying about missing out on any of the 85%. And I think if we take that mindset into how we have conversations about material that we output, it's going to make everything simpler and everything cleaner.
That was group 2. So we're going to move on to group 3. Who's the spokesman?
You're so busy having a back channel that I think it's fascinating that we talked about so many things. Julia, can I pick on you instead? My head's spinning.
I have to unmute myself. We were talking a lot about authenticity and the importance of that. Now I've just been thinking about I'm already on this chain of thought of all the things like what Luke was saying was making me think of other things. So I'm already onto that, and
I think you were saying something about Julia. You picked up on the idea of actually showing what you're saying. Or
yes.
That's that level of authenticity. So if you're going to talk about something, what can you show for it? What's your proof that you're actually doing it?
Yeah, and we were talking about also, not if someone is asking a question or just really listening to what they're saying, because then that will tell you what's important to them. And then you can give them information that's relevant for them, and also not trying to be perfect and telling people what they want to hear, but being really honest so that they have true understandings of our schools, and we make sure that we get families that are the right fit for us. So not trying to be everything to everybody, but really being true to our schools.
I think that's what Caroline had said as well, that they're maybe guilty as a profession of trying to sell to everyone, please everyone. I think take a school like, take ISB, David, sorry to pick on you, take ISB as a school, and one of a third of your mission, a third of your tagline is about being inclusive, when by definition you are incredibly exclusive. And it creates a challenge to say authentically that you're a really inclusive school when you're patently not. And so parents, when they arrive on the doorstep, there's a risk that we think that they understand even what inclusion means, what it means we are inclusive. They may not have any idea what that means at all. And so they need that concrete story to understand what you mean by that. And you have to be prepared that if they saw what inclusion means, that they're part of that. And so if that's a thing about schools having confidence that what they are, that the pool is rich enough to attract the right parents, not that they have to chase every scrap of parent out there or student out there. And that's, I think the ocean's huge. The demand for international schools is just massive, which means you can get the right student, because when you get the right student with the right experience, they tell all their mates who are just like them too. And I think that's what helps grow communities, not trying to be so general to the point of bland. And a lot of international school sell is really bland. A lot of mission statements, really bland. They don't tell you anything. I'd like to say I loved, Miles, what you shared initially, and it was the perfect segue from the meeting I just come out of. And I think it opened up an interesting thing in my head, because the meeting before was about the other half. If you've made the video that's got them coming in through the door, my view is you've already sold to them. And if they walk out the door without having then said, all my children and all the children I am yet to have are going to come to your school, then something went terribly wrong in that part of the relationship. And I think that's where, in the admissions game, it's the listening that is crucial. so that you can hear where they're coming from and help them relate to that little slither of the story that is going to be their world, because the whole story will never be the whole story for them. It will only be part of it.
Miles, I'd like to, you and I have worked together and worked on a project at ISB just in the last year. But one of the things that, having worked in this business for quite a number of years now, I've seen an evolution on the school side between back in the early days, we needed external people who could produce videos because we had no internal capacity. And then what happened is we began to realize that we had some capacity to produce video materials for ourselves. And I think one of the questions that maybe to be a little bit provocative to you, maybe you can articulate when is the point that you do it internal, and for what reason do you go external? And I think that's one of the things that many schools are struggling with is if they can answer that question, they will also be able to have better conversations with people who need to approve budgets and so on. Because it's like many aspects of our industry, people are saying to us on the inside, well, you can do that yourself. We know that, there's a line somewhere. Maybe you can put some words around how you would answer that, because I'm sure it's not the first time you've answered that particular question.
No, it's not. And it is certainly a conversation that comes up all the time. There is, without wishing to be flippant to start off with, I do find it extremely amusing that of all the professions in all the world, video making appears to be one of the ones that gets degraded so quickly as soon as a piece of technology comes along that allows you to do it. I have a set of spanners downstairs, but I am not a plumber, and it is an interesting scenario that we find with video particularly. I think there's a couple of things going on here. You're right. Anyone can point at an iPhone and hit record at things, okay? Invariably, if we are engaging with an external agency, it is not necessarily because of their technical competence, unless that technical competence is demonstrably higher and that effect on screen means something, because it looking pretty is an entirely, could be irrelevant to the actual message, okay? But predominantly it's around the ability to accurately read your school and then present it back in storytelling form, okay? So the execution of our concept work is sort of the equivalent to what Ewan was alluding to there about the idea of like once they're in, so it's to then execute for us should be a bit of a given, okay? But if you are stuck in one of those feedback loops, that was a phrase that came out in our little group, of where you've got people saying, but it's important we also say, and oh yes, but what about this? And let's add another value, and let's add another mission statement, and so on and so on and so on and so forth. Sometimes engaging with an external agency isn't necessarily about their technical competence. It's about their ability to be a third eye, an informed third eye, and come in and perhaps break that feedback loop and say, actually, you know what, here are some different ideas. So it's not necessarily about engaging per se with a producer for their technical competence, although personally I think that is very important, because I think the visual look is an enormous part of the emotional read that people take, but that's another argument. It's about the creative interpretation of what is there. There is also the question of properly engaging with the idea of video strategy. Now, this is something that I think, again, is an evolution in admissions and marketing within independent schools and international schools and so on, because we've gone from video being, on nobody's radar to sort of on the radar to aggressively on the radar. And that's how it's been certainly in the last 12 months. The amount of let's just video it, or let's put a message out by video has become extremely important. And I think we've now got to the stage where we've got to recognize that to use video effectively, it needs a strategy, in much the same way as to use social media appropriately. It needs a strategy, okay? Without looking overly prepared here, if I may do that little bit of screen sharing again, this just helps in terms of me talking around something. But when we're talking about strategy, we talk in very simple 3 tiers, and this is how the vast majority of commercial video production video content strategies are built, albeit probably more nuanced than this. But we simply talk about a tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 attitude to video production. So an awful lot of what I've talked about has actually been within the realms of tier 1 production and frontline brand pieces, that piece of video that genuinely catches your eye, the advert more than the promo, okay? And I don't think, well, I've never met a school that has got not just the technical competence, but the detachment to be able to produce that effectively, okay? So the ability to genuinely look from the outside without the obvious political machinations that go on with any school, or the ability to discount things that they're emotionally attached to, etc., etc., etc. So for me, that is a necessity. When we start, in terms of external engagement, when we start getting into tier 2 and tier 3 production, which are both equally valid, because again, to pick up on Ewan's point, if you get people on the hook and then don't work them, you've massively missed the trick. You've arguably done it's a bigger fault than not having had the hook in the first place, okay? So when we start getting into supporting video content, where we are giving people, I don't know, more details on our athletics program, or more details on our academic program, or whatever it may be, we are in a realm where it is perfectly feasible that a competent in-house videographer can pull together something worth watching. One of the biggest problems, however, is people often mistakes this tier 2 content as being worthy of tier 1 usage, okay? And that's the problem, because that tier 2 material is for somebody who has already started being emotionally invested, all right? And you cannot use, athletics at ISB, for want of an argument, to completely turn the head of somebody from complete cold. It won't work like that, okay? But when we're then into that tier 2, that's when we can start potentially looking at in-house capability, or indeed lower cost external capability. That's perfectly possible as well. There are plenty of local wedding video makers who are perfectly capable of putting together supporting content of this type, but it is not your shop window. And that's an important point to make. We also grant a huge amount of credence to what we would call UGC, tier 3 content, okay, which is genuinely in-house produced and has that authenticity, a word I'd love to do another session on, that gets people properly under the hood. And really gives people an idea of the sort of warts and all, because by this point the audience is suitably invested in the emotional experience of the organization, that this makes sense to them. They're no longer posing questions about value and statements like that. They're so invested. They want to know more. They want to look in every nook and cranny, which they may not want to do when they're at that tier 1 level, because the emotional investment is not yet there. So incredibly wordy answer to a very simple question. But it's a question of looking at where in your strategy does this video sit, and do we need the external, yes, technical competence, but also the external creative detachment in order to be able to execute an idea properly.